with us this afternoon that would like to make any public comments? Seeing none, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is approval of the minutes from the April 27th, 2022 meeting. Do we have any changes to the minutes?
I'll move approval.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Cindy, vote please.
Evans,
Yes.
Anderson,
Aye.
Ehrenfeld,
Yes,
Sanders,
Yes.
Gish,
Yes.
Martin.
Yes.
motion passed. Next item on the agenda is the quarterly updates and reports. Chief, this new arrangement isn't going to work very well for you. You're going to have to stand a lot.
That's fine. It's good. It's great, actually. So in your packet is our normal quarterly reports, our staffing, who owes who for what, for May and June, for April and May. We don't, because Grimes works on a cash basis, we don't do June just because we wouldn't get the whole month in. And so that'll be on the first quarter of this current year. And we've also got the balance for the purchases. And I don't think there's any benefit in going over all those. We've also got the fire marshal report. But what I did include in this packet is some new reports. We ran some additional data. One of the things that was pointed out in the ESCI report is that we had some poor data. And so Fire Marshal Verheuel went to a conference up in the Twin Cities area and was able to meet with our records management system people that build the reports, and found out what we needed to do to change some of our reports and get some better data. And so we've included some different reports that you've never seen before. Our response times going back 2018, 19, and 21. Some of the times showed that we're getting out the door and to our destination much quicker than what the ESCI report showed. Part of that is how we're able to get the correct data now, and going forward, we should have much better call data. One of the other things that one of the council members or board members asked was like medical versus non-medical. How do we know whether we need to send a fire engine? And so we've got a report that shows that when we go emergent, when the communication centers get the 911 call, they process the call and determine what type of call it is, and then they use what they call emergency medical dispatch to tell us whether we should go emergent, lights and siren, or non-emergent. And so when we go lights and siren, an emergent call, they also trip out an engine because sometimes they're closer, and time is what saves people. So we want to try to get the closest resource there as quick as possible. So that shows the difference between emergent and non-emergent calls where we're sending that engine. And that's why when we talk about having an engine and an ambulance in each station, that's kind of what we're basing it on, is that a lot of our calls are still calling for that engine. They can still be there first, but they don't have that ability to transport. And sometimes there are patients that can benefit much more from getting to the hospital where they have respiratory therapists and can perform procedures that we can't out in the field. The next report is structure fires by hour of day, and that is in comparison with the calls by hour a day, which is 2 more over. And so fires, and I think I've got a repeat in there, 2 of them. One of them is all types of fires, the first one, and then the next one is only structure fires, so when an actual house or building is on fire. And so that one doesn't look quite as much like what I would say the normal bell curve when we took all of our calls, which is what was also shown in the ESCI report. So just trying to give you some additional information on different types of reports. And again, some of this is based on questions that we've received from different board members and different council members. So we're just trying to run some additional data and some additional reports. But I don't think we need to go over and spend any time. We've got some other issues that I think are much more pressing than going through reports.
Chief, I do have a question that I'm just a little curious about.
Yes.
On the updated fire report data,
Yes.
Do we have there what the actual response times are? Do we have goals?
Yes, and that's what's called out in the ESCI report, and those are national standards. We should be there in 8 minutes for
For
what we
first?
call an effective response force, or have an ambulance there. Yes, actually less than that for the first arriving, either fire engine, fire ambulance on scene. So we're working towards those goals, but again, the more that we can ensure that our data is correct, the better reports we'll be able to give, so.
Yeah, I think putting that benchmark on that report so that we can
Sure.
see
Be
that would
helpful,
super
yeah.
helpful.
Yep, that's a good idea. Okay.
Any other questions for the chief?
Again, when you talk about, anytime you pull first, second, third, fourth out data, talking to some of my colleagues and other people, there's still confusion about that terminology. And so I think including an explanation of that terminology is helpful.
Sure.
Because it's a district definition, not a station definition. I think a lot of people thought it was a station definition.
It would be for the entire district,
Right.
so, yes.
Any other questions or comments? No, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is to discuss a proposed staffing model to reduce overtime and part-time expenses, to reallocate funds to increase full-time staff to meet the minimum staffing goals, reduce the need for mandatory overtime, and assure adequate staffing to serve the citizens. Chief.
Thank you, Mayor. So I provided a lot of information in your packets, kind of outlining the problem or the issue. To kind of summarize it, our normal staffing is 11 people per day. Our minimum staffing is 10, and that gives us 2 ambulances out of the middle, fire engine, and truck crew, but it's 3 people jumping between those 2 resources out of Station 39 on Merle Hay, and then 3 firefighters over in the Grimes Station 37, and they will, if they're in the station and there's a third out call, they can take the ambulance, but it's very rare because normally if we have a third out call, that engine is already on probably the second out or the first out call. And so it's very rare that we're able to staff our own third out call. So 2 of our 3 shifts only have 10 full-time people assigned right now. Last fall, when we asked for staffing, I asked for 3 additional staff full-time to put 11 full-timers on every shift. Johnston, we hired 1 this summer. So 2 of the 3 shifts only have 10 full-time assigned. And then the other shift is actually still short 1 because we got a person on long-term disability. So we're still running 10 full-timers to try to cover 11 spots. So that extra shift we're trying to cover with part-time. Part-time is not covering all those shifts, and they're not covering the vacations that we have during the day or during the month either. We're the last service in the metro, really, as far as our size and our response model, to rely so heavily on the part-time staffing. In the report I gave you, I show that we tried to do another part-time staff hiring this spring. We had 14 applications, which we usually get 40 to 50. We end up getting 7 that had certifications. We interviewed the 7. The captain said, well, 5 of them would probably be a good fit. Between the time we offered the job to those 5 and 3 weeks later when we started our training academy, we had 3 of those 5 drop out. We had 2 complete the academy, and then once we put them on the rig, get them cleared so they can run as a 3rd firefighter instead of a 4th person, an extra during their training. And as soon as we cleared one of those 2 people, they turned in a resignation. They just too busy and had multiple other jobs, so they didn't really give us anything, and we spent thousands of dollars training them and getting them ready to go, and we got no benefit. So we are really short. We've had 11 people leave part-time employment in the last 12 months, and we've only been able to replace 1 at this point. Yes.
So I understand the 3 shifts a day and your goal is 11 on each of those shifts. how big is your pool of full-time to pull from? I mean, because you've already stated, no, I'm talking full-time. I'm going to ask you about part-time, but first I just want to know, you've already talked about how you don't have full-time because they're on long-time leave or they're on vacation or there are other reasons. So how many do you start with to get to 11 on 3 shifts? How many do you have?
Start with the 10.
No, I mean, how many total is in the pool for full-time?
With 30 full-time.
You have
That's
30.
10 per shift, yes.
So your full-time people are serving a shift every day? They're not. There's some that are on long-term, like they serve 4 days on and then they get days off. So how many from your,
Of those 30, 10 are working, 20 are off. Then after their 2 days, then the next 10 work. And that's how we end up with 30 to try to fill 33 spots, basically. They work 48-hour shift. They work 2 days on and have 4 days off.
but every day, I'm just trying
Yes.
to get this in my head. Every day you need 33.
Every day we need 11 people.
How long's a shift?
24 hours.
Oh, okay. That's where my problem is.
Yes. They actually work back-to-back 24, so they work 48 hours and have 96 off.
Okay.
So that's our 3 shifts.
So now I understand it. I was like thinking there's more people here, but no. All right.
One of the things I had, we had talked about internally here is that from my standpoint, from the number standpoint, and from some clarity standpoint, Jim and I kind of have opposite personality quirks. He likes to throw in a lot of words. I like to throw in a lot of numbers. And so we have a tendency to maybe lose people when we're trying to explain what we're talking about, okay? And so we met earlier this week and I asked him to come up with this bullet point to talk about if the specific item on the agenda was to discuss a proposed staffing model to reduce overtime and part-time expenses, to reallocate the funds to increase full-time staff to meet the minimum staffing goals, and to reduce the need for mandatory overtime and assure adequate staffing to serve our citizens. How can I do each one of those things? And so, as he said, to do each of those goals, our goal would be to have a normal staffing of 11 per day. We only have 10, okay? If our minimum is 10, and we have people calling in or something like that, numerous times, the captains who are preparing the training, who are preparing reports or doing other types of captain administrative duties, they're doing the fire. They're riding the seat, as they have explained to me. So they go out into the engine or the ambulance quite often. And so with two of 3 shifts only having 10 full-time people right now, we're definitely, and the other one is short due to that long-term disability, which, we'll see how that turns out. When it comes to the part-time staffing, then they're not covering that one other extra shift we have anymore. And the model of full-time and part-time staffing has changed dramatically since I've worked for the city of Johnston. When I started, we had 5 full-time firefighters and like 30 part-time firefighters. It's gone the other way. And part-time firefighters throughout the metro are becoming a rarity. They just aren't existing anymore in departments. They're having to go to these full-time firefighters because people want the job, a job that has benefits and is more secure for them. So to meet the goal of staffing, we would have to have at least 11 per day, okay? When we talk about budget, then we talk about the numbers for me. I had 2 opposing factors. We had so many spreadsheets that Jim prepared for all of us. How many spreadsheets we looked at? But we went back and forth between budget numbers and actual numbers. And the issue is that not his fault, but in each of the last several years, we've had to mend the fire department's budgets because of overtime wages and and partially part-time wages, but specifically overtime wages because we haven't met what he had budgeted. So when he prepared this document for you, that's in the packet today, and it talks about your part-time budget for FY23 and your overtime budget for FY23. This was the one Excel spreadsheet in your budget, or in your packet. I was concerned that he's talking to you about budget numbers because we're already over budget in the fire department because of a mandatory overtime that we had in July in the city of Johnston. So if I look at actual numbers versus budget numbers, and I looked at the actual budget numbers we spent last year for the city of Johnston, and I took this wage of about anywhere from $83,000 to $87,000, depending upon whether you're a first-year paramedic or a third-year paramedic, or whether you're a firefighter, EMT, or where you fall on the pay range, and the cost of benefits. They're slightly different between Johnston and Grimes. So let's say it's between 83 and 89. We kind of averaged about 87 or something like that. And you took last year's cost for the city of Johnston and the city of Grimes, last year's actual cost for overtime and part-time. It cost more than it would cost for 8 more additional firefighters with the benefits. So not these budget numbers, but actual numbers last year. And what happens when Jim comes to us and says, I've got to amend my budget, the only place that Jake or I, Marcia, Jim, the only place we can find money is from reserves, because we've already levied a long time ago. So if we know exactly that we're going to have this many part-time people, and this is what their wage is, according to a union contract, and this is what it's going to cost us for benefits, we're going to be way closer at our budget amount number than we are when we have all this mandatory overtime that we have and this part-time. So I wanted to focus on that number part of it and tell you that financially, from my perspective, it's going to save us money. Now, I also am going to put myself in your shoes, which I always try to do, and tell you that you have to hold his feet to the fire and say, okay, you get 8 more firefighters, and this is what it costs us, then there better not be this kind of overtime. And we've got to make sure operationally that this is really only costing us what it's going to be, and that you aren't going to come back to us next May and say, oh, I still need another $70,000 because this is what it did cost me in overtime. That isn't going to work. So if I'm
Why would that happen, Teresa? What worst
what
case
would
scenario,
happen-
why would that happen?
What would happen is if he or Ron or the other DC, decide to start letting people take vacation whenever they want to take vacation, and we're backfilling shifts for vacation with overtime. We're still going to have to say, no, only this many people can be gone. We're going to have to say, if you're sick, this shift has to be covered. It's not, it's not going to be mandatory overtime. You have to be here. We're going to say, you no longer have to take 48 hours off to be gone. If you have to take your child to the doctor and it's going to take you 2 hours away from your shift, then you take 2 hours off, not 48 hours that I have to find somebody to cover and pay overtime for. We're going to have to operationally change, and he's going to have to make some tough decisions, and the firefighters are going to have to support us in those decisions and allow us to get them more people so they don't have to do overtime. They're sick of overtime too. So I'm telling you, and I talked to Marcia, if we look at our budget numbers aren't high enough, Jake. Our FY23 budget numbers for Johnston or Grimes are not high enough to add 8. They're high enough if I look at last year's actual numbers. So we're still going to have to amend the budget to get to those numbers. But I'm here to tell you, I'd be amending the budget anyway because I already know what he's spending in overtime.
You're not amending as far
Yes.
as we have in prior
Right.
years as well.
Right. So that's why I'm at the podium, and that's the part I wanted to talk about with you guys. And now I'll gladly go sit down and let him hit you with all the words again. And let's
Teresa-
talk about the captain seat and the this and the that.
Teresa or Chief, just for the sake of conversation, you've got on the spreadsheet included in the packet,
Mhm.
the budgeted overtime number it might be helpful context if you could share with us what we actually spent between both communities.
Yeah,
Do
I
you
have
have that
that.
readily available?
Yeah.
I can tell you, we've already spent half of Grimes overtime in the first 4 pay periods of this year.
Yeah.
I had Marcia run the numbers. We budget 48,000, we spent 23 something.
But this happened last year, right? As well?
The last year,
So-
we spent $236,000 in overtime and $475,000 in part-time.
If we had that trend for all of last year and we already knew we were way overspending our overtime, why didn't it get presented to us to increase that overtime budget?
He did.
Meet that
he
demand.
did.
We did,
We did?
but
Yeah.
$12,000 is all we increased it for this current year over last year.
So was it presented to only do the 12,000 or,
That's what we budgeted, 12,000 more for Grimes.
but my understanding about the numbers, you knew that wasn't probably gonna be enough.
You know,
Well,
part
we-
of our problem is we work on the budget in December,
Sure,
only halfway
yeah.
through the year. I think it was about Christmas time, unfortunately, when our one firefighter became severely ill.
Yeah, and that's a significant factor in it. So,
Yeah, so,
That's fair. Okay.
And again, we've always had good luck hiring a bunch of part-time people.
Yeah.
Didn't happen this year.
Yeah.
And so this all really came about by going to both city administrators and saying, we're hemorrhaging the budget and our people are getting all burned out because they're getting mandated. I mean, we've had people get mandated twice in the same payroll period in
Yeah.
2 weeks' time. And we just said, we can't keep going this way.
Yeah, no,
And that's
I'm
when
with
Jake
you.
actually said, well, look at the numbers. What
Mhm.
does it actually cost if we go to all full-time versus this reliance on part-time we've always had?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so that's when we started looking and it's like, well, wait a minute, the wages are there. It's really just adding the money for the benefits
Right.
to pay for the full-time.
So just a little bit more context for the board. And some of this is laid out in the narrative that the chief gave us. But I mean, we went around and around about the alternatives. What alternative solutions exist to this issue of unbudgeted overtime? And how do we solve for that? And spent a lot of time discussing and studying the part-time solution. You're using part-time to fill those holes in your schedule today. And it's hard to recruit part-time people. It's hard to schedule part-time people. He's got some language and some information put together as an alternative to reduce service levels. And I think in my mind, and, you know, I don't want to speak for anybody, but, you know, I think as we studied the alternatives, solutions to the problem of overtime, we think just restructuring the pay for part-time people and the overtime that we're spending for full-time employees is just a better long-term solution.
But, Teresa, if I'm looking at this page that has the fiscal year 23 for Grimes and Johnston, what's the difference between the left and right column?
So this is where I, not being a finance person.
this is where Marcia and I disagree with him.
Differs. So the left-hand column
Yes,
shows the full entire cost. But in the current part-time figures that are budgeted for both Johnston and Grimes, we already account for FICA, Medicare, and IPERS. So to me, it's double counting those figures when you're looking at, well, what does it cost? And so the column on the right is deducting the money we've already included in this year's budget for FICA, Medicare, and IPERS, because it doesn't, to me, if you owe me $30 and I sell you something for 60, I'm probably going to just say, well, give me $30. The difference, instead of saying, okay, well, give me the 60, then I'll give you the 30 that I owe you. That's how I look at things in my mind, because I'm not a finance person. So the column on the left is the entire cost, all the benefits for a full-time firefighter, and we're talking 5 for Johnston and 3 for Grimes. And that's the full boat, or all of the expenses figured in. The one on the right deducts those 3 that are already budgeted for, because the payroll dollars are really about the same, actually a little bit less depending on who we hire than what we already have budgeted for part-time.
For where we're at in the year, you got to pay attention to the first column. Because we wouldn't have levied taxes in the employee benefits fund in either city to pay for the benefits. You got to pay attention to the full cost this year. Next year, Chief would plug these numbers into his general fund budget, and we'd budget employee benefits out of the employee benefits fund. That hasn't been done this year, though.
Okay, so I'm trying to catch up here.
Okay.
You've thrown a lot of information at us, and I did read the material in advance, and I thought I kind of had it figured out. Now I'm probably more confused than I was before I walked in, but bottom line, here's what I want to know. If we hire 8 full-time people in order to reduce the overtime and the part-time, what is the gap in what we would have to spend?
Mhm.
That's the
139?
139,000 for Johnston, and was it almost 60?
62.
62, 720 for Grimes.
Okay, so that's what we would have to come up with in each community.
Last year, our overtime and part-time for both cities totaled about $711,000. Councilman Gesh, and this year in the budget, we only have budgeted $625,000. So
Now that's what matters to me.
So I'm saying that 711,000 minus 625,000 means it actually cost us that last year, and we'd be finding that money anyway, is my fear.
So we're not quite eating up all the difference, if I'm understanding correctly, but
I think we will eat up all the difference. My fear is we'd eat up all the difference anyway, and
And then
and
And
still
then-
short people and not have the staffing that we want.
we can feel extremely confident in saying that worst case, though, there is a difference, but it's pretty negligible. Okay, because that's a good starting place, because then it financially it could even be better than that. But yeah, okay.
But at
But
the rate
this-
we're going, it's going to be way more than last year.
Right,
Because we're,
right.
like I said, we increased the Grimes overtime budget, and we've already spent half of it.
Right. I'm just trying to think, what's the narrative, when you talk to my colleagues, because they say, well, the numbers don't say that. And like, okay, but it's this and maybe even worse. And here's why it's worse, because they're going to look at the numbers and go by just that. So I'm trying to understand what narrative I need to present. So,
But this assumes all of the disciplinary actions that you talked about, managing vacations and
Yeah.
time off and all of that.
Because the contract allows for 2 off. So what this hiring will do is actually put 13 people on each shift. It allows 2 to be off on vacation, and then we're still at 11. And so we're at our full strength. And there's days when we don't have anybody on vacation. Those days we'll upstaff an extra ambulance, which will hopefully gain more revenue, because twice yesterday we had to call for another ambulance from another community because we ran out of resources. We had a third out twice yesterday. And those numbers just keep increasing every year, the number of concurrent calls. And so when we have people extra, we're not just gonna, just be fat and happy and have extra people. We're gonna put them to work on an extra ambulance. That way we'll be able to answer our own third outs on the days when nobody's on vacation.
So Chief, how confident are you that everyone will agree to that discipline? And that these are the real numbers that we're talking about?
Right, and again, I think that's what they will understand, is that they're gaining the stability that this is gonna
Right.
give by having all these full-time people. So,
Chief, isn't there a portion of the firefighters that like that overtime though, and perhaps depend on it as part of their income?
I don't know that there's many of them that like being mandated in.
Right.
You know, it's different when you get to choose a month ahead of time when you want to work extra.
Mhm.
It's a lot different when you get a phone call and say, hey, you got to be in here in 2 hours or at 6 o'clock tonight to cover because somebody called in sick. Then they have to get rid of, change all of their plans and make arrangements for childcare if they're the ones that are staying home with their kids or whatever it is. That they don't like. And that's what we're trying to reduce is we've had so much of that we're paying them mandatory double time for to come in last minute. So
The unfortunate scenario that the chief and the city administrator discussed was also just going down instead of having our goal of 10, lower our goal to 8, which meant less responses. Well, nobody wants to do that.
that
Less
would
equipped
give
out
us
the door.
one ambulance basically. And then if the first call happens in Johnston, the second call happens in Grimes, and then the Grimes crew, if they're in the station, could jump on that second out ambulance. But it's really reducing the amount of time we'd be able to transport our own patients within our own district and relying on other services to do a lot more training.
There was, Chief, I need you to help me remember, but in the ESCI report, there was a theoretical staffing
Yes.
model
Part
laid
of the
out.
report, they said in order to cover the amount of people that we have and let them go off on vacation and have those 2 off, they said we needed 7. And that was just a mathematical formula that they used based on the number of full-time people. And they said we needed a staffing factor of 7 more.
That was 36, right? 36 people in the report, or did it say 37?
I think it was 37.
37. So we're able to go with modestly more resources than what's already in your budget, just restructuring mostly what you've got there. You're able to achieve and exceed the staffing level recommendation in the ESCI report.
For where we're at today, yes.
Right.
One other question of clarification is if you're going to hire 3 full-time, the math pans out because you're assuming no part-time, but are you actually going to assume no part-time? Are we truly eliminating all that part-time?
At this point, I think it has to almost be all or nothing, or else we're still going to have that reliance that we have no control over. And that's part of the problem with part-time is that we don't control their schedule.
No, and
They
that's
schedule out a month
fair. I
ahead
just
of
want
time.
clarification as well.
Yeah.
I don't need a justification. It makes sense to me. I just want to make sure the math is actually going to match what you're going to do. Okay.
And that kind of leads into my question, because I think that you have justified the hiring,
Mhm.
but how quickly could you get new full-time people on board? It would take quite a bit of time, would it not?
Yeah, it would probably be December or first part of next year, January, probably at the earliest.
To be fair, you're already short part-time, so even if you tried to pick up the part-time, it
Yeah.
might take just as long
It
either
would.
way, correct? Yeah.
We would have to do, because we exhausted the list that we had, we'd have to
Mhm.
start all over to hire more part-time. And again, we've had really good luck with retaining full-time people, but we have not had good luck with part-time. In 5.5 years, we've had over 65 part-timers leave the department. We've had 75 total, but 10 of those we've taken and hired from within and created full-time positions. So hired 10 of those 75, but yeah, 65 other part-time people have left. And just the last year, we had 11 leave and we hired 1 back because
I've had the opportunity to sit in on many of these meetings talking about this, and Chief Clark's done an excellent job in getting the numbers together and helping me understand and helping all of us understand the advantages of doing this. The one thing that we haven't talked about is a level of service to our citizens. Certainly, this creates issues for our firefighters and our staff and others, but what this does, in my opinion, is that it provides a better level of service and that it's going to be more consistent. We're not going to be relying on part-timers that we sometimes can't even get to cover shifts. Hopefully with us partnering with our staff, and as we talk about some of the things we have to do from a personnel standpoint to make sure we have that coverage, I think it provides better service to our citizens, much more reliable service. It also is more efficient when you think about, and I worry about with our full-time firefighters, the fatigue factor. If you've been on a 48-hour shift and you're asked to stay another 24 hours, I mean, there is a fatigue factor in there as well. Again, I think that goes back to the service for our citizens. But when those firefighters are asked to stay for another shift, first of all, that's disruptive to their personal life, but also we're paying double time, correct? And so, having firefighters that are actually working on within the budget on, what their normal pay would be, we're not paying twice for the same individual to cover the same hours, twice the expense. So there's a lot of reasons why this makes sense. And probably the main one is the issue about getting part-timers is a huge issue right now. And I just think this better serves our citizens if we have a much more reliable department and making sure that we have those staffing numbers where they need to be, which is at least 11 on every shift. This gives us a little bit of wiggle room to have people off and doing training or whatever reason they may have to be off. So,
Chief, I just want to say that this makes a lot of sense, and I support this idea as you laid it out, and I appreciate looking into the numbers and giving the numbers. So I do support it. I think one thing that, just out of fairness and clarity of the situation, is I would have to assume our part-time wages year to year do not grow as fast as full-time wages.
Not consistently, but we've increased them recently to try to
Yes.
attract more. And
But
that was one of the questions that kind of drove all this discussion is, Jake says, well, what do we got to pay him? I mean, do we got to pay him $30? Well, if you pay a part-timer $30 an hour, that's the overtime rate for a full-time person. And we still can't guarantee that they're going to fill every hole that we need to fill.
right, what I mean to say though is I think it would be fair to make a note, and again, I support the idea, but this could potentially mean instead of the budget growing X percent like it has the last few years, it's going to grow this much more because you have more full-time, and as benefits go up and those wages on the scale and how that's all, that can be important to some people. Not that I want to necessarily give ammunition to the idea, but I think it's fair to lay out all of it.
No, absolutely. And like I said, what we're really looking at is adding the cost of the benefits for the full-time people, because the dollars are there. The amount that we're spending on part-time is about the same as we'd be spending on full-time. But when we look at some of our people, some of our part-timers are going over the 30 hours that's part of the Affordable Care Act. And so we've tried to say, okay, well, if we hire more, then we can cut back on some of their hours. But some of them are the ones that are the only ones available when we have an opening to come in and work. And so they're not only making basically full-time wages, they're getting overtime. We've had several of our part-timers get hundreds of dollars in overtime in a pay period because they're the only ones available to come in, and we just can't get enough to spread that out.
the other thing, Chief, is several of our good part-timers have left to go full-time in other departments. So we've lost people that we've invested in training and providing that service to go to other departments. And I'd rather have those people stay here. Give them the opportunities here in Johnston and Grimes.
I've already said that I pretty much support the proposal, and I will reference back to something the mayor said to me once about the safety of our citizens. And she said that a long time ago, so holistically on the Johnston Council, that this was before I got on, but the decision was made to prioritize public safety. And so I think this fills that role.
Has to be a priority. Chief, I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
It sounds like we're at least hearing support for what you're proposing to do here. So, and it sounds like our finance staff also think that thinks this makes sense as well. Okay, so when are we looking at implementing it? And how do we cover that funding gap?
Well, I think first thing would be is if there's consensus, then, a motion to move forward with hiring the 8. And then again, it would still have to go back to each council, for the 5 and the 3.
Right,
And then we would go through the hiring process and open up a list. I think that we would get a different applicant if they knew that we were going to have all these openings and hiring right away. We've just completed an open application process, and again, we did not get very many applications for full-time, just because we have a list that's expired. So we wanted to make sure that we could have potential if somebody were to leave, we wouldn't have to wait months to start a process again. But I think the fact that if this gets approved and approved by both councils, if we were to put out an application to say we are definitely hiring, we're going to get a little different applicant pool than ones that just put on an application just because they see that somebody's got an opening or that there's an application process in
so
progress.
what I'm hearing you say is that it would be your hope, your expectation that we would move forward with this as soon as possible.
Yes,
as
but
soon
it
as it can be.
still would be probably December at the earliest before we'd have them actually filling all those holes.
Okay, okay, so then how are we going to pay for it?
Well, technically, we're paying for a lot of it already,
Right.
because we're paying the overtime, we're paying the,
Well, I understand, but I asked the question, what is the gap between what we're already paying and
In dollars?
compensating these full-time employees? I understood that we had a gap of 139,000 and it's either 62 or 48. I'm still not clear which one of those numbers.
I guess I'd ask you to allow Mark and I the time to prepare the response to that question.
Okay, and that's fair.
Our councils. I think both of us kind of had a couple ideas already about where we could maybe get it that isn't necessarily in the reserve, but it would require a transfer funds from another area. But I guess, and I don't know if you saw that Marcia was back there. She and I talked a couple times, or talked yesterday and again today. And I think that both of us could come up with a couple responses to that question to share with both councils when the time comes up to them on their.
And that's fair. I just want to make sure that, we need to be good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars and we don't say, yeah, this is a good idea, let's go do it, and then not have figured out where the funding is going to come from to pay for it.
But at the rate we're going, we're going to have to figure out how to pay for it by the end of next year anyway, because we're way over overtime, both sides,
Yeah.
so.
Figure out how to pay for this or figure out how to pay for a lot of overtime. Either way, you're gonna have to figure, but yeah, you want it laid out.
Or we reduce, or the other option is to reduce our response level, and when we're down to 8.
I
That's
wanna be
not
on
my
that one.
recommendation, that is, yeah.
So Chief, kind of something the mayor just brought up, if you're thinking, oh, if we could do this right away, we could go out. I would leave this to your judgment. You would know better than me. But I kind of imagine if you threw 8 full-time positions out there and you get all these applicants, you're going to take the best 8. Would you maybe end up better in the run if you do 4 now and take the best 4, because a pool in 6 months is going to look a little different, or 3 months or whatever, and then take the best 4 out of that one? Does that make sense?
But it's still not gonna fix the problem, because anytime we would have 2 people off, we would still be 1 short.
Sure.
And then we'd be paying overtime or mandatory overtime to fill that 1 spot.
Right. Well, and we're going to be paying overtime until we get there anyways. And so I'm just thinking long-term, I would rather do the right thing, pay a little extra to get really good full-time people that could be here for a very long time. But I also understand what I'm saying is I'm willing to spend more money. Maybe not everybody else is.
Chief,
It's something to consider.
can I chime in here quick? part of the issue that we've had in hiring, and everybody knows everybody's having problems hiring every position, but when the situation is we have one opening, and it takes so long to turn that one applicant into a, whatever it is, police officer, firefighter, whatever it is, they're hesitant to apply. Then you factor in Des Moines pulling in of every available candidate in their academies, and the rest of the metros getting away from the part-time model. The pool shrinks exponentially all of the time. So if we have an opportunity to say we're hiring 8 people, that takes those part-timers that are working 2, 3, 4 part-time jobs and puts them back into our full-time pool, which they're not doing in our part-time pools, because they are, and the chief can give you more specific numbers, but we have the majority of our part-timers are working part-time somewhere else, at least one other place, while they're waiting to get their door or their foot in the door. As soon as those full-time jobs come, they're going. So we talk about hiring. We have people in our full-time pool, our part-time pools now, who would be interested in being full-time, but we just don't ever have openings to get them in. So they're always looking somewhere else. So that's what Jim Sanders said was, we're training them. We've become the training ground. We train them, we get them certified or whatever you guys call them, and then we send them on their way to the next full-time job. So by posting that we have 8 available positions, I think we widen our scope and we bring in those part-timers that are really looking for full-time jobs.
Yeah, so if I understand, and thank you for that. Basically, if I put it in my own words, and correct me if I'm wrong, please. The pool is kind of what the pool is now, and it's not going to change a whole lot, and in fact could get worse because more people are going to get snagged out of it.
Correct.
Okay.
Des Moines
thank you.
hires like 20 a year. This year they hired, I think, about 40 people. They didn't even get everybody this last round that they thought they were going to get. But they took 3 full-timers and a part-timer from Urbandale. They took at least 3 full-timers from Ankeny. And again, we always have that to contend with as well. I mean, we may hire, if we get this approved, we may hire 8, and we still may be looking for more January, February, whenever Des Moines opens up their list again, and we may have people jump ship because Des Moines has more
Yeah.
fires, they pay more, and some people, that's what they're looking for.
Yeah, no, thank you though, that helps.
So Chief, what you're needing from us this evening is a motion to make this recommendation to our city councils.
Moved.
Second?
Have a motion and a second, further discussion? Cindy, vote please.
Martin,
Yes.
Gish,
Yes.
Sanders,
Yes.
Sternfeld,
Yes,
Anderson,
Yes.
Evans.
Yes.
motion passed. Moving on to the next item, report on the preparation for the fall collective bargaining unit negotiations.
So we've been meeting, Deputy Chief Burrow, myself, Eric Fisk, and Cindy, and we've been going through the contract and looking for things that we can kind of clean up some language. And I think it's important that we look at things that really don't make sense anymore. Most of the contract is really language that was developed, I would say, at least 6 years ago. And so we've just kind of been going through and trying to clean all that up. The union, by state statute, has to certify again this fall, and we expect that that will happen, and then they will, make a proposal. They'll reach out to the cities and say, hey, we've recertified, it's time to start talking about the next contract, which expires next year, June 30. And so normally in the fall, that's just the normal process, 9 months or so before the contract expires, there'll be negotiations. And so Jake just wanted to make sure that we let the fire board know that we have been looking at the contract, trying to clean up some of that language, and make sense of things that really don't necessarily make sense. I mean, there are policies in there about how they call in that are listed in the contract that really don't pertain anymore, because back then, we didn't have the captains that kind of running their shift and taking those calls at 5 a.m. It still says that they called the chief. And so We just want to clean up some of that language and make sure that it makes sense for how the operations are actually going on today versus how they were years ago.
Yeah, I think I just wanted the board to know that we're trying to approach that with some intentionality. That we had this ESCI report done, we've got updates in front of you tonight to the 2080 agreement. And I think we just want to make sure that operationally for the chief, there's alignment behind the study, the 2080 agreement, and the labor contract, because those are the documents really that speak to how it ought to be done, how we govern, and how we actually provision the services. So we want to try to make sure those things are lined up and serving the residents as best as possible.
Any questions for the chief? If not, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is to review and discuss the first draft of the updated 28E agreement.
I was working on that document, and I was intending on filling the rest of the meeting with this conversation. We have a minute left, if you want to end by
You should
5.
probably fill it.
But what we have before us, and I want to express my appreciation to Jake and Chief Clark. We've been working on this together, and part of this is taking what we learned from the ESCI report and trying to incorporate it into our 28E agreement. Now, the current 28E agreement goes until June 30th, 2023. So we're trying to get an early start on this. We have a lot to work out with this. One of the main things that we learned from the report that I think for our fire departments to be more effective is that we need to think longer term than 3 years, which has been what we've been doing since 2007. We've had this 2080 agreement, and we tweak it every 3 years and continue with that. If we want to go to the next level and really get our departments working together as more of a one unit organization, we need to look longer term. And so just in the beginning of this agreement, or I guess at the term that we've proposed is a 10-year term. And within that, we're suggesting that there's a lot of things that we need to do in the next 10 years to get us working closer together, get us working more as one unit. And so the way that this is structured, it is a 10-year agreement, but we also have 3 or 4 things that have shorter term goals that we need to meet to make sure we keep moving forward with that. But what we did with this document too is I tried to pull out talking points, because I think, and you can see that's the way this is really structured. We've got a number of talking points that are suggested here. And the purpose of that is for this group to talk about this and make sure that we're all on the same page of how we want to deal with each of these issues. And so my intent this afternoon was to go through the document from the beginning to the end and stop at each of the talking points and talk through those. So we can certainly begin that process now. Like I mentioned, the agreement is not completed or finished until June 30th, 2023. So we have a little bit of time, but when you only meet quarterly, we don't have as much time as we think we do. So that's sort of a brief introduction, I guess, to what we're trying to accomplish with this. And any questions before we get started, or if I guess, do we want to get started on it, would be the first question. So,
Jim, I find it unlikely we could get through the entire document
Right.
before 7 o'clock, or maybe even later. I'm wondering, should we schedule another meeting before October 18th and just focus on this?
Sure. I think that'd
That
be
make
appropriate.
sense?
This is a big enough
Yeah.
issue that we need to, I
So
think
that we're not
focusing on it.
distracted by everything else that might
Right.
come on the agenda.
Yeah.
So maybe sometime in September, getting back together again and just working on the document.
Yeah, I mean, that's consistent too, right, with what we heard from ESCI when they presented, is there may need to be more regular meetings. And there's a lot here.
There is.
Yeah.
I think having a whole meeting just to concentrate on this would be a good idea. I've talked to Jake about this, and I think it's maybe a little early in the process for this, but I think one thing that would be really beneficial as we get further along is some case studies, if you will, of, so for example, if under this agreement, we were to buy a fire engine, what does that look like? What's the process? What does that look like? Because then that would help us, especially me, I don't speak whereas very well, so.
Good way to put it.
So if you could, have some of those scenarios laid out as like, this is what that would look like under this agreement, I think that would be super beneficial and helpful.
Are you talking about a bonding issue where we were both bonding?
Well, just any and all of the above, like if we want to increase a staffing level, like what the chief presented tonight, what's that look like? How does that get approved and how does that get factored into each council's budget? If we want to buy an engine, what does that look like? How does that get budgeted, right? Like those scenarios that we often see, especially when it comes to dollar and cents, that I think a lot of people sit at the table here, at the end of the day, care a lot. I mean, of course we care about service, but we gotta be responsible for those pennies. And so understanding how those pennies get decided is, I think, rather important.
So more of a nuts and bolts understanding of how this agreement translates into day-to-day discussions and issues.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Mhm.
Other comments or questions? Jim, do you want to send out a doodle, or who's our staff? You're a member. Cindy, do you want to send out a doodle poll then, and we'll get a date set in September? If September what?
Your September is filling up.
I know, and October is too. That's why I retired.
I'm wondering if it might just, because it was on the agenda, and, there are some folks here, if maybe just for the sake of the viewing audience to hit a couple of the high points. There's a lot of talking points here, but, you called out the 10-year term. We've contemplated the creation of a management committee, which is just the administrators and the fire chief, and kind of formalizing how that works today. That also would take the administrators off the fire board. We've contemplated putting all of the firefighters on one payroll or the other. Those are some of the high points in my mind that might be worth just sort of announcing because it's on the agenda.
Besides the two you just announced, Jake. The page 7 to me is also pretty important to think about in terms of if you look under item 9 and look at items 1, 2, 3 there. So we, as I said, we have interim goals that are suggested here. And so the first one there being that the how we're going to utilize our staffing levels to try to work on our staffing to a more aligned pay and benefits and those kinds of things with our staff. And as I mentioned, if everything falls within the time frame of the current agreement, the new agreement would start July 1 of 2023. And this suggests by June 30 of 2024 that we would have a transition plan for pay and benefits for the existing members of the fire departments. And so that would be one of the interim goals. The second interim goal is number 2 there, where we talk about how we work together with the capital equipment and infrastructure needs, because we know we have capital and infrastructure needs for the departments. I think that gets, David, more to your question as well, is if we purchase a piece of equipment within this agreement, how does that get accounted for and how does that work? And so again, so that appeared, or at least in our initial conversation, would be sort of the second piece. After we get the staffing piece worked out further, we then work on the CIP, CEP piece, and the June 30, 2025 is the time frame, sort of an interim time frame. And these time frames are just to sort of keep us going and working in the same direction. That certainly could change as we get into each of these issues. And then the next one is continue to evaluate our staffing needs. We had a great conversation today about our existing staffing, but we know we are growing communities. And so how do we manage our staffing going forward and continue to have that conversation? And so a June 30, 2026 was sort of the interim goal on that. And then the idea of, if we're working towards converting the fire department to a single organization where it stands alone, either within our communities or outside our communities, really trying to get that decision made by June 30, 2028, which is halfway through this agreement. This agreement may change if we go in that direction. This maybe becomes a contract for service as opposed to a 2080 agreement. And again, those are all things we need to talk about, but I think it'd be very difficult to get all that done by June 30th, 2023. That's why we thought if we could get into a longer term agreement and set these interim goals and continue to work on those things might be the best route to go and still provide important services to our community. So that's the way this is set up. And then, as Jake already mentioned, there's a couple of things, other items that are big changes that are also contemplated in the agreement that will need a lot further conversation as far as whether the administrative functions are taken away from the board and kept at a policymaker level. I mean, that'll be a big decision that we need to make, and so that's how this is set up, or at least some of the things we've been talking about that are, again, a part of the ESCI report that we received. And I think this is sort of moving that report forward and figuring out how we can work together to implement that.
So Jim, just so I understand, the concepts that are in this draft and the proposed changes, is that something that you and Jake worked together on, or how did these proposed changes come about?
Well, we've been talking a lot about implementing that report, and so Jake and Jim and I have been meeting and talking about this.
Okay.
And so,
Okay, just so we know who's been involved.
yeah,
in these
we've been
discussions.
the primary one specifically on the agreement, and how do what does it look like when we try to implement what we learned from the report? And so we'll take blame for that, I guess.
Or credit.
Credit, whichever it ends up.
Other questions for Jim or Jake?
I guess I'm going to be the bad guy in the room, because my gut was the last time we met was that there didn't seem to be a real consensus that we were ready to move forward with an agreement, that there was still some wanted to be a part, some didn't want to be a part. There was still some confusion. I love the fact that it looks like we're moving toward an agreement for 10 years. But my guy's telling me before we sit down to hammer all this out for another 10-year agreement, we need to have commitment from everybody on this board or whatever, that that's the route we want to go. And I am not, nobody specific, but I've never met the Grimes mayor, and I've been on the council 5 years, and I've been on this board 5 years. I just wanted to get that out there. So
I think that's a good point. And if you look at, just going back to page 1, our first talking point is when we talk about the whereas clause, where we want to desire to increase our level of coordination, cooperation between the fire and EMS departments. The first talking point is we need to confirm our intent to work towards this. And I think that's getting exactly what you're saying. Are we all committed to doing?
That's the first thing that popped in my head.
Yeah, are we committed to doing this? I think is the first question we need to ask. And it's not just us. I mean, we only represent 2/3 of our council, 2/5 of our council sitting here by the council members that are here. And so there's 3 other council members that also need to be bought into this as well. So, and that's, as we're talking, I was thinking, as we take the proposal for staffing forward, certainly from Johnston, I'm not sure how Grimes works, but we need to have those conversations with the other 3 council members, before we take it to a council meeting to make sure they're well-versed in what we're going to be asking them to consider.
Another reason not to get into this discussion tonight, we are a little lightly represented here this evening. We need to make sure that we have as many people on that are members of the board present when we have these discussions.
I think, yeah, I hear what you're saying. I guess I don't want to speak for the mayor, who you pointed out is not here, and others. But I will, and if I'm wrong, I'll take the blame. I think the Grimes Council has the willingness and intent to move towards that agreement. I guess I would just put an asterisk on it and say, though, they want to see where the rubber hits the road, though, which you can't really show that until you flush this out, if that makes sense. So I think the willingness is there. Beyond that, until they see it all, I don't think all my colleagues could say much more than that.
Yeah, I mean, for whatever it's worth, the way I guess I see how business is conducted in Grimes, I mean, we gotta put a proposal in front of them that's been somewhat vetted. I don't think we're gonna call a meeting and just kind of pose the question whether or not we're committed to public safety or the relationship, because that, I mean, we gotta have a proposal that we can chew on and talk about and think about, and I think that's what we've done. But I think personally, I think it starts at the fire board, and you start to build support and momentum from there.
So we just have to find our date in September.
Yep.
Does the Grimes City Council do 7 o'clock in the morning meetings?
You know, this one's gonna stop doing that.
We have a lot of 7 o'clock in the morning meetings with our
And
council
sometimes
members.
people miss them.
Yeah, well, I know. I didn't know if you guys even did that. We do it quite often, actually, so it sounds like we may not be doing as much.
Well,
I don't think
Sounds like a
I don't think in 5 years we've ever
Summation
done
meeting.
that.
Oh, really? We have a couple a week almost, it seems like.
Yeah. We've done some spur of the moment evening ones for sure.
Yeah.
but-
Okay. We won't use the 7 o'clock time frame for this
it
conversation.
would not be my preference.
yeah.
Don't do that on the doodle poll.
I don't
Sunday.
like to use words until about 9, so.
That's my guy right there.
Okay, anything else on this item? Hearing none. Do we have any other business?
I would just like to throw out there an idea that obviously the next meeting, we want to look at that 28E, but at some point, I think it would be beneficial if we took a real hard look as a board at like, what is the service model? And what do we want the service model to be to better guide chief? Because I think when you talk about staffing should be a means to an end to affect the service model you desire.
Absolutely.
And I feel like sometimes that language is sorely missing. And so I think if we could come to an agreement on what that should look like, that would empower the chief to take that language back, to make his cases better when he has to. So and I'm not saying in the immediate future, but at some time I would entertain that as a board topic.
Is that something, Chief, where you would kind of put a concept on paper or?
Yeah,
Okay,
and use data and use variables, I mean, similar to the ESCI study, but. Where the ESCI study fell short is actually in like Urbandale, when you say they've got 1,500 more calls for service than we do, but using their response data to show what that extra ambulance in that station, how that makes a difference to them compared to us, where we've got 2 stations that don't have an ambulance. And so I think, yeah, that would help to drive that discussion, is to probably dive deeper into some data mining for us and saying, here's what this means.
Any other business? If not, we have the future meeting dates listed there for us. We're going to be adding an additional one in September. And is there anything else to come before the board? Seeing nothing, then we are adjourned. Thanks, everyone. Good meeting.
Thank you.
You guys, have you ever talked about franchise fees? You don't have franchise fees